Welcome back to WW2 TV. I am doing another reaction video. It is to another video by the Armchair Historian. It's his bird's eye view of D-Day, and I'm going to say right at the beginning, I really liked it. But, as you'll find out, there are some glaring mistakes, perpetuations of myths that I think I'd like to address. So yeah, full credit to Armchair Historian for doing some fantastic work, some fantastic animations, but I am a D-Day historian. I have lived in Normandy for 22 years, and there are some mistakes in here I'd like to address. So without further ado, I'll start the video.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, or D-Day as it's more commonly known, is one of the most well-documented events of the Second World War. Countless books, movies, and even video games have covered the landings on the Normandy coast in great detail. Yet it can be confusing to figure out exactly how each landing was different, what the German defenses looked like, and what exactly happened once the invasion forces got off the beaches. As such, we'll be zooming out from the chaos on the ground to give you a bird's eye perspective of the D-Day landings. First, we'll be flying across the American sectors from the chaotic nighttime drop of the airborne all the way to the advance off of Omaha Beach. The invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, commenced in the late hours of June 5, 1944, as an armada of C-47 transport planes carrying the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions made its way toward the Cotentin Peninsula.
So my first comment is about pronunciations, and it's going to be me being really picky here, but if you're going to pronounce the names of places in France, either do them kind of the Allied way. So when we later on we get to places like Sainte-Mère-Église, just say it in that kind of English version of Sainte-Mère-Église, or say it the French way of Sainte-Mère-Église. It's the Cotentin. What Griffin says there is neither one thing or the other. It's just, it's wrong. Sorry, but it is.
The elite paratroopers were entrusted with the crucial task of paving the way for the seaborne forces landing at Utah Beach.
Maybe it's really picky, and yes, a lot of the airborne forces are paratroopers, but it's already dismissing the huge and vital role of the glider-borne elements of the two divisions, bringing in the glider infantry, the artillery, etc., etc. So yes, we think of the two divisions as being paratroopers, but that is only a percentage of their fighting capability.
Just after dawn, the 101st would secure the causeways between the towns of Saint-Martin-du-Verreville and Poupeville, while the 82nd would capture the crossroads at the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and secure the vital bridges across the Mérida River at Chef-du-Pont and La Fière-Menor. However, things go awry almost immediately as thick inland cloud cover and intense ground fire complicated things for the pilots. In the resulting chaos, most paratroopers miss their drop zone.
Now this is interesting because he says most paratroopers miss their drop zones, and I realize that is the conventional narrative how we look at the airborne landings, both in the American sector and indeed the British and Canadian sector. But actually, if you look at the drop patterns, it's fair to say that the great majority of paratroopers either landed in the exact ovals that indicate the drop zones, or they landed very, very close to them. The idea that most of them missed is not really correct. It's the narrative we've been telling. And sure, a significant number of paratroopers and later on glider infantry did not land in their correct zones, but to imply the majority were not where they were supposed to be is one of these narratives I think needs changing. They don't often know where they are, these paratroopers. They are often unable to work out exactly where they are because there are no features near them. The church tower is all at the same, etc., etc. But a great majority, probably I would say as much as 70%, even 80% of the paratroopers are within a mile or two of their drop zones or actually on their drop zone. So I would argue immediately that most of the men were not where they were supposed to be.
Zones entirely, as they are scattered all across the peninsula. Those who land safely nonetheless manage to quickly form makeshift units as they make their way to the nearest objective. In most cases, the confused German defenders are quickly overwhelmed. Sainte-Mère-Église becomes the first French town to be liberated at around 4:30 a.m. as
Now, this is interesting, and I'm being really picky here, and people are going to say, oh, Woody, you're being really picky with this. It is often referenced, and I have to say that the Armchair Historian's books that he is citing there's some fantastic books there. Peter Caddick Adams, my friend, Sand and Steel, Chester Wilmot's in there, some Ken Ford books. There's some really fantastic books there. Now, we all will have read that Santa Maria Glees was liberated on the morning of June the 6th, but it's about language. It's often, as I talk about on my channel, it's about the nuance of language. Liberated to me must mean end of fighting. If you're liberated, that's when the locals can come out and they can start waving flags and sharing chocolate and Coca-Cola with the American soldiers, etc., etc., etc. Santa Maria Glees was still under fire. There were still engagements being fought in and around it until almost the second half of June the 7th. So it's a misleading statement to say that Santa Maria Glees was liberated. There was a flag raised, absolutely. Colonel Krause, the 505th, raises the same flag he'd risen above the town hall in Naples a year earlier, whatever it was, above the town hall in Santa Maria Glees. But a flag flying does not necessarily mean liberated. So it's a minor problem. And again, I love how this graphic representation of what's going on is working. It's brilliantly conveying what's going on, but it's a bit misleading to say Santa Maria Glees was liberated.
As men of the 82nd dig in for the expected counterattack at the La Fière Menor and Chef du Paul bridges to the west. The bulk of the 101st due east, in the meantime, are in the process of clearing the 5 causeways to the landing beach, where the invasion force anchored just offshore is about to make its approach. The fleet's target was a 5-kilometer stretch of flat sandy beach just east of the airborne drop zones, codenamed Utah Beach. On board of the invasion fleet were the men of the 4th Infantry Division. Their objective was to establish a beachhead approximately 5 kilometers wide and 8 kilometers deep, with the ultimate goal to isolate the Cotentin Peninsula.
Cotentin Peninsula. Again, I'm being picky. Perhaps it should have referenced the men of the following waves that were to come ashore later on, because although the 7th Corps, it is the 4th Division who are the primary assault unit, we do know that members of the 90th Division were ashore probably by the latter part of June the 6th and certainly by the morning of June the 7th. I know this is about D-Day, but it's about understanding that landing forces have waves of people coming ashore, and the 90th Division were part of the 7th Corps on D-Day, and elements of them were ashore on June the 6th. We're pretty certain by the end of the day.
And capture the deep water port of Cherbourg. The first step in achieving this objective would be to break through the defensive position of the German 709th Static Infantry Division before advancing inland on the 5 main road exits.
4.
Besides flooding the nearby farm fields, the defenders had littered Utah Beach with 3 lines of obstacles, consisting of steel spikes and mined wooden posts, as well as an array of anti-tank obstacles. The Utah sector was covered by 9 resistance nests, or Widerstandsnesten, which were manned by platoon-strength garrisons totaling about 700 troops. At 5:50, the fleet commences its bombardment of known German positions along the coast. Meanwhile, 270 bombers close.
I'm going to pause it with one of the aircraft flying over there, because the same animation sequence is used later on in Omaha Beach, and it's very well done. These are, I guess, meant to be B-26 Marauders, while they're B-25 Mitchell. Either way, they're twin-engine bombers. Now, the thing about Utah Beach is the bombers came down following the coastline. They had turned to come sort of south along the beach, coming sort of from the direction of Cherbourg south, which meant they're flying over the defenses sort of one at a time. It was on Omaha Beach that they came perpendicular to the beaches, but the animation suggests they are coming perpendicular to the beaches on Utah as well, which is misleading. I would also, he goes on to say that the bombing on Utah Beach was not very successful. I would contend that it was pretty successful. Because they're coming in. It was the 9th Air Force. Remember, the 9th Air Force are a tactical Air Force, the 8th Air Force a strategic Air Force, the 9th Air Force coming in lower. The aircraft they're using, the B-26s, are kind of used to low-level work. And if you look at some of the accounts by the 9th Air Force pilots and crews on D-Day, they are reporting hitting targets. They are knocking out some of the Widerstands. They're certainly The Widerstandslicht to the south of the actual landing site was definitely hit by the Ninth Air Force and partially eliminated. Some of the other bunkers were hit as well. Some of the communications were hit. That's very key on Utah Beach, is the bombing force coming down the beach were able to hit some of the telephone communication lines between the Widerstandslicht, which meant that there's little communication between the Germans. And when, as Armchair Historian explains later on, the landings came place in the wrong place, the Germans were not very good at communicating with each other to explain the situation. So it's a little bit incorrect to say that the bombing on Utah Beach was not very successful. I would argue that it was pretty successful, certainly as about as successful as any of the bombing was on D-Day.
To further soften up the German strongpoints. However, hindered by poor visibility and anxious not to hit the invasion force, few pilots managed to hit their targets.
Really, if I'm being...
At 6:30 hours, the first wave of 20 landing craft carrying part of the 8th Regiment approaches the beach's two sectors, Uncle Red and Tear Green. They're supposed to have landed behind a vanguard of amphibious DD or duplex drive tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion. The 70th tanks, however, are struggling to advance in the face of heavy headwinds and wade ashore late around 6:45 a.m. Luckily for the infantry, German resistance is lighter than expected, and besides some small arms fire, most casualties on the beach fall victim to artillery fire and mines. As it turns out, the strong swell that morning pulled the landing craft a mile or 1.5 kilometers southward to a sector less well defended than the previously designated landing site. Despite this good fortune, incoming artillery fire covering the various beach exits continues to cause casualties and hamper the advance throughout the early morning hours. A few miles inland, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division resolve the issue as they conduct a set of daring assaults to silence the German batteries at Oldie and Brecourt Manor. With these guns neutralized, the men of the 4th Infantry Division manage to overrun the remaining German beach defenses, and by 8:30 hours are ready to begin their advance up the causeways.
Now, that again is a little bit misleading because it's suggesting there's an absolute and direct correlation between what the 506 are doing with regards to these gun batteries and the progression on Utah Beach. Well, firstly, the elimination of Brecourt Manor is not in any way over by 8:30 in the morning. It isn't till early afternoon when that battery is eliminated. Maybe the gunfire had ceased earlier, but the battery is not eliminated till a lot later than 8:30. But if you look at the after-action reports of the units coming ashore on Utah Beach, despite the idea we have from the Band of Brothers series that knocking out the guns at Brecourt and Holdie saved countless lives on Utah Beach, things were going well on Utah Beach anyway. And yes, the elimination of the guns at Brecourt and Holdie, and indeed the guns at Saint Martin de Varaville as well, that were eliminated by the 502nd earlier, although they had already been hit by the bombing in the previous days, so they weren't the same threat. But there were several gun positions and German garrison positions at XYZ, notably further up the coast, that have been eliminated by the Americans, that are absolutely influencing the success on Utah Beach. But it's not the direct, they're stuck on the beach and only when the paratroopers knock out these guns can they move inland, direct line that the Armchair Historian has connected here. I would argue that even if the gun batteries hadn't been eliminated by the paratroopers, things are still going sufficiently well for the 4th Infantry on Utah Beach to push their way inland. Again, you're probably thinking watching this, I'm being really picky, but the thing is, this channel has 2 million subscribers. Clearly a lot of time, a lot of effort goes into preparing these scripts, preparing the animation, and I think it's kind of make sure you get it right and consult with people. Have someone review it before you upload it. But again, I'm being critical about some of the details, but overall I think the video is fantastic.
Around noon, men of the 8th Regiment make contact with elements of the 101st Airborne Division at Poupeville. Further inland at Saint-Marie-du-Mont, the regiment's 3rd Battalion prepares for a battle but finds the town already liberated by troopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who had cleared it in close quarters fighting earlier that day. The swift and mostly painless advance of the 8th Regiment is finally ordered to a halt at the end of the day at the crossroads at Les Fauges, some 10 kilometers inland. Meanwhile, men from the 12th and 22nd Regiments, landing in follow-up waves, move to secure the northern and northwestern flanks of the beachhead until they too penetrate around 10 kilometers into German-held territory. By the end of the day, the Utah operation had been a success. The 4th Infantry Division had achieved nearly all of its objectives in return for just 197 casualties, a number far lower than had been anticipated. The Airborne Division.
Now, it's a frequent issue when we come to the data about losses, is the misuse in comparative terms of things like casualties, because there on the screen there it says casualties 4th Division 197. That is the accepted fatalities on Utah Beach, or at least it's the old accepted fatalities. If you look at more recent studies, for example, the D-Day Memorial in Bedford, that although it focuses on Omaha Beach, also looks at what's happening on Utah Beach, we can probably agree now that the actual number of fatalities on Utah Beach actually goes over 200, maybe 230, 240. Still substantially lower than some of the other beaches, but it's fatalities. Whenever there's a figure for fatalities, you can assume there's twice or maybe 3 times that number of wounded. So if you have 100 dead, you often have 200 or 300 wounded. That's, of course, in the ETO, the western sector of the ETO. If you're talking about the Eastern Front, where there's less in the way of taking of prisoners and there's less treatment for wounded, it changes there. But in the ETO, places like Normandy, Italy, Sicily, 1 to 3. So roughly, if there's 1 person killed, there were 2 or 3 wounded. So that graphic there on screen is not representing the entire casualties of the 4th Division. And also, it's not mentioning the engineer brigade, or it's not specifying that 197 killed is not just the 4th Division. That includes the engineer brigade who are coming ashore there as well. So it's misleading. And again, with airborne, it now talks about casualties. So now it's talking about the casualties. So it's including the dead, the wounded, and the missing. So it's just a bit misleading. It's implying that the losses on Utah Beach were very, very light, which they were, but they weren't quite as light as how that graphic
divisions had suffered more heavily during their chaotic nighttime drop, but they too had managed to achieve the majority of their primary objectives. Within 24 hours, the Americans had established a firm beachhead on the Cotentin Peninsula through a mixture of exemplary skill and sheer luck. Some 23,250 men and 1,700 vehicles were ashore, with countless more to follow in the days, weeks, and months to come. These fortunes, however, would be in short supply for the American forces set to land further east. About 15 kilometers to the east of Utah Beach, a group of 225 elite soldiers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, are headed towards the protruding cliffs of the Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers were entrusted with the...
I'm going to be really picky here. Pointe, where do you get Pointe from? Either point or pointe. In French, Pointe du Hoc. In English, Pointe du Hoc. But Pointe, where do you get the sound on Pointe there? Again, this doesn't really affect the actual history, but it's just annoying. Point or pointe, but not Pointe.
Daunting task of scaling the 30-meter high cliffs to prevent its artillery battery from pummeling the American invasion beaches. Once on top, the Americans would have to fight their way through a series of defensive works and obstacles manned by men from the 716th Static Infantry Division in order to reach the gun emplacements. Things don't start out well for Rudder's men on D-Day. His troops are scheduled to land at 6:30, but due to a navigational mishap, they don't reach the beach until 10 past 7. The alerted Germans greet the Rangers with small arms fire, grenades, and even rocks as the latter begin making their way up the cliff.
Unfortunately, this is, although it's well done, it's perpetuating the idea that there are hundreds of Germans defending at Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June the 6th. As we now understand, Pointe du Hoc was under development. They were in the process of restructuring the defenses there. They'd moved the guns inland. They were building new overhead protected casemates to replace the open circles. And because of the construction work, because the materials going in there, there weren't more than a few dozen Germans there at break of dawn when the Rangers start attacking. And the idea of the Germans throwing grenades over the edges and all these losses on the cliffs there is mostly that post-war narrative. A lot of it derived from the Longest Day film. The majority of Rangers, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but he doesn't make this clear in the video, that the majority of casualties at Pointe du Hoc. The American casualties were much later in the defense of Pointe du Hoc. So late on June the 6th, in the evening of June the 6th, and even in the morning of the 7th, when the Germans counterattacked towards the battery, and the movement up the cliffs and across was pretty damn quick by the Rangers. Only one Ranger was killed on the cliff climb, and that may have even not been to enemy fire. That may have been to accident. So we need to move away from this idea of the Germans throwing grenades over the edges and everybody being, fired out on the cliff assault. That really isn't quite how it was. It was very stressful. It was very noisy, and the physical effort involved to get up those cliffs was incredible. And we pay tribute to the audacity and the bravery and tenacity of those Rangers there, but we must move away from this idea that that's where the majority of them were wounded and killed in this engagement. That was much later on. I'll stop grumbling about that now. But again, I love how the animation is done.
7:30 hours, the first exhausted Rangers have made their way to the top to find a moon-like landscape of deep craters created by preliminary bombardment. In a wild and frenzied scene, Rudder's men storm the emplacements only to find that the guns are not there. Fears that their sacrifice had been for nothing are soon alleviated when a patrol finds that the guns are intact in a field just behind the Pointe. With their main objective completed, the remaining Rangers dig in for the inevitable German counterattack and wait to be relieved by the invasion force landing at the neighboring Omaha Beach.
See what I see? It implies there that the fighting was over, but actually the big fighting was still to come at Pointe du Hoc.
The western end of Omaha Beach lay just about 6 kilometers to the east of Pointe du Hoc and stretched all the way from the area around Viryville-sur-Mer to the cliffs near Colleyville-sur-Mer, some 8 kilometers to the east. The most prominent characteristic of this wide and mostly sandy beach was a series of bluffs which offered a commanding view over the coastline. 5 natural draws between the bluffs offered the only exits off the beach for vehicles and heavy ordnance. The Germans were well aware of the potential for a landing in the Omaha sector and had constructed an intricate web of obstacles and resistance nests to cover the approaches to the draws. The beach itself had been littered with obstacles of all kinds. Soldiers disembarking in the shallows would first have to traverse an array of mined stakes and iron frames, as well as hedgehog anti-tank obstacles. Barbed wire covered the seawall and dunes further on, while the draws were blocked off by minefields and concrete walls, as well as remote-controlled flamethrowers. Furthermore, in order for soldiers in most sectors to even reach the draws, they would have to cross the shelf, which was a roughly football field-sized gap of open ground between the seawall and the base of the bluffs. But to even get to that point, the Americans would have to brave a deadly and sophisticated set of resistance nests. Most of these strong points were hidden from sight, camouflaged and placed at an angle to protect them from enemy fire.
Hidden from sight it's an odd way of saying it, because yes, theoretically, if you're in the front of a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, you can't see some of the defense ahead of you, but hidden from sight and camouflaged, there's the implication that the Allies didn't know where they were. Well, with the aerial photos they'd taken, with the mapping they had done, with the information they had got from the French resistance, they pretty much knew where all the defenses were on all the beaches, bar a couple of confusing ones in the urban areas of Juno and Gold, for example, and Sword, where they had incorporated the Germans some bunkers into some buildings. But on Omaha Beach, the Allies have mapped this out. So they are hidden from sight, but they're not hidden from intelligence, if I can be distinct there.
The slight curve of the coastline also meant that resistance nests on both the eastern and western edges of the beach could provide interlocking fields of fire across the landing ground. 3 additional resistance nests were positioned behind the bluffs should the invaders manage to break through.
And I would have mentioned, if you're talking about the 3 Widerstandsnetz inland, I would have also mentioned the artillery batteries that are inland. You mentioned them on Utah Beach. You talked about specifically about the taking out by the paratroopers of the artillery batteries at Brecourt and Holdy. Well, there are even more artillery batteries inland from Omaha Beach. Some of them are 352nd Division, some of them are others. But if you want to get your viewers to understand the strength in depth of the Omaha sector, you really should have mentioned the artillery, because you can look at the artillery batteries as having caused eventually a considerable number of the casualties on Omaha Beach. So that's artillery firing from 2, 3, 4 miles inland. So I would have liked to have seen the artillery batteries reference. Even if you don't know exactly where they are on the map, which is kind of more specialized knowledge, you could at least have mentioned the fact they exist.
In total, the resistance nests in the Omaha sector were composed of 8 big gun emplacements, 35 pillboxes, 18 anti-tank guns, and 85 machine gun nests, being the largest and the most well-defended of the two.
It's really picky, but when he said there the 85 machine gun nests, the 85 number of machine guns is one of those figures that has been doing the rounds for as long as I've been looking at D-Day. There is still work being done on how many of those machine guns were MG34s, MG42s, how many were earlier types of German machine guns, how many were foreign machine guns, how many were actually in fixed concrete positions, how many were being able to be carried by infantry guys from one position to another. So there's still work to be done on the number of machine guns, but I would say 85 is erring on the exaggerated end of how many machine guns on Omaha Beach. Certainly the machine guns that we think of as being the really dangerous ones, the MG34s and 42s, it might be as many as 85, but including, I say, foreign weapons, older weapons, and the question also is how much ammunition did the Germans have for them. But yeah, that's me being picky again, but that is my job.
American beaches, Allied Command had assigned both the 29th Infantry Division as well as the veteran 1st Infantry Division to secure the bluffs by 7:30 hours, link up with the British forces advancing from Gold Beach at Port-en-Besson, and securing an overall beachhead 26 kilometers wide and 8 kilometers deep. At 5:55 hours, the preliminary air and naval bombardment begins, pounding the German positions, but once again the bomber pilots delay.
See, I mentioned this on Utah Beach. They've used the same graphics here, but the bomber force on Omaha, although this time the angle is correct, they were coming in perpendicular to the beach, and this is just about the animation. It was 4-engine bombers. It was B-17s, mostly some B-24s in Omaha Beach. So it was 4-engine bombers at a much higher altitude. So, okay, this is a simple animation to convey it to the general public, but by having twin-engine bombers there, it is incorrect.
Too long and end up missing their target entirely. With the German defenses still intact, the first wave begins to make its approach at 6:30. Some landing craft are hit as they close in on the beach, and many soldiers are cut down. To make matters worse, almost all of the DD tanks that were supposed to land ahead of the infantry have floundered in the rough channel waters after having been launched far too early at 5.5 kilometers from the shore.
Now, this is my biggest bugbear with this whole video. I have talked about this repeatedly on my channel. There's information out there. For those who don't know, there are 2 battalions of DD tanks coming ashore on Omaha Beach, one at the western end, one at the eastern end. The unit that suffered the losses is the unit coming ashore at the eastern end, where of the 32 tanks, 27 or 28 were sunk on the way in for the reason he correctly said there. The nuance, though, is that both of these battalions have the assault wave of DD tanks, and then later on they have another wave of tanks with the slightly less sophisticated but also sort of semi-amphibious method of the wading exhaust, and some of those tanks make it ashore. And then there are other waves, including dozers and regular tanks. But by saying that most of the tanks floundered, you're missing out the other battalion, the battalion that landed at the east, supporting the 29th Division, who got most of their tanks ashore. Why? Because they saw what was happening to the tanks further to the east, to their left, and they didn't release their tanks into the water too far away where the waves are too strong. The landing craft tank commanders had them come in much, much closer to the beach. The majority of these tanks drove straight off the landing craft and were there on the beach to support the assault. Now, they came ashore a bit later than H-hour, but they definitely came ashore and they definitely played a big part in the assault off the beaches there. So this is one of the things I'm always talking about. And I've done a show on my channel about this with Steve Zaloga, who talked about the DD tanks. It's perpetuating an idea that all the DDs were lost. Most of one battalion of DDs were lost, but the other battalion mostly got its shore tanks. And as I say, both of these battalions have other waves of tanks coming in later on the day. So there's this implication that all the armor is lost on Omaha Beach, which is not the case. Some tanks were lost, but others came in later on. This really annoys me because this information is out there. It's out there to find that there was a significant tank force available to Americans on Omaha Beach. And this annoys me.
Within minutes, Companies A and F of the 116th Infantry Regiment landing at Dog Green and Dog Red are virtually wiped out. However, not every sector of Omaha is as well defended. At Dog White, G Company reaches the base of the beach within 4 minutes of landing, while at Fox Red, at the far eastern end of Omaha, men from the 16th Regiment make use of the cliffs in that sector to shield themselves from enemy fire. At around 8 o'clock, a group of men under command of General Norman Cota in the Dog White sector managed to blow a hole in the barbed wire in the Dog White sector and advance up the steep bluffs to take out WN-70.
And that's a really important story to convey. And people who know me know I love the General Cota story. And it was a little bit later than 8 o'clock. I would say it's more like 8:55, 9 a.m. on the morning of D-Day, but that's a minor thing. But the thing is, yes, they went over the bluffs, but they didn't go over the bluffs by going over the bluffs. They found and used another gully or draw that the Americans were less familiar with. It hadn't really shown up on the aerial photos, etc., etc. And we now call that gully Cota's Draw. So to me, the absolute important part of this story is they found this gully that gave them a protection from enfilading machine gun fire, etc., etc. And that's the gully, the draw that Cota and his men used to get from the beach up through the bluffs to the top, where they did indeed, as the Armchair Historian explains, move on to attack Vierville-sur-Mer. So really good that he's got the General Cota story in there. Really annoying that he's missed out the fact that they used this gully, this draw, that was in between D1 and D3.
Before moving on to clear the Vierville draw. To the east, in the Fox sector, a group of soldiers led by Lieutenant Jimmy W. Monteith similarly managed to fight their way up the exit and take out WN-60. Really well. The majority of the troops near the draws are, however, still hopelessly pinned down, and their sectors quickly become congested with the arrival of subsequent waves. To make matters worse, the incoming tide begins to shallow the wounded and the dead, while slowly reducing the size of the beach even further. Sensing catastrophe, a group of U.S. Navy destroyers brave enemy fire as they move in as close as 800 meters from the shoreline. With their direct fire support, 8 German gun emplacements are knocked out, providing enough of an opening for the ground troops to recontinue their advance up the bluffs. With the German defenses now being breached in several sectors, the tide begins to turn in the Americans' favor. The assault teams on the bluffs quickly swing west and east to flank the remaining German positions, while the other groups advance on the towns of Vierville and Colleyville-sur-Mer. By the end of the day, the Americans at Omaha had secured the bluffs, but the advance off the beach had only reached 1.5 kilometers inland. This precarious foothold on the Normandy coast had come at the cost of over 4,000 U.S. casualties.
So just going back to what I said about Utah, on this occasion, he's used casualty again. So he's using the figure that includes the killed, wounded, missing, and 4,000 is about right. It's about 800 or 900 killed, and the rest are wounded. So you've made the correct distinction about casualty compared to fatality here, but Utah, you've got a bit confused.
Still, Omaha had been secured, and the Germans lacked the strength to attempt to push the Americans back into the channel. By nightfall of June 6, 1944, it was clear that the American landings had succeeded. Despite the initial chaos of the U.S. airborne landings, the efforts at Utah Beach had been nothing short of an astounding success. Omaha Beach, on the other hand, had veered dangerously close to catastrophe. Yet here too, the Americans had ultimately established a firm foothold that was only to expand in the days and weeks to come. However, relative success in the American sectors did not equate to the success of D-Day as a whole. Arguably the most important of all the landings on June 6th were taking place further to the east, where British forces were attempting to capture the medieval city of Caen and prepare for a clash with the brunt of the German armored reserves.
So, kudos to you, sir, for acknowledging and getting across to a predominantly American audience that the landings in the British and Canadian sector were vital to how D-Day ended up being a success. So my hat off to you for that, sir. Fantastic. However, just going back to what you said about Omaha Beach, this idea that Omaha Beach was close to disaster, it could have very nearly all gone wrong, I just don't go along with that. If you look at the work of the majority of modern historians, people like James Holland, Peter Caddick Adams, who you cite, Sure, a few things went wrong and quite badly wrong in the early moments on Omaha Beach, but I don't think, and a lot of modern scholars do not think, that Omaha was ever really close to absolute disaster. There's just so much firepower available to the Allies. The Navy have so much firepower to bring to bear. There's such an enormous landing force coming in. There are only about 800 Germans defending the entire sector, which, interestingly, you didn't talk about the number of German defenders. You mentioned the number of German defenders on Utah, but didn't give an idea of the number of German defenders on Omaha. It was only going to be one outcome on Omaha Beach, and that was an Allied success. Yes, the first wave paid quite considerably in high casualty rates, but there was a second wave, a third wave, a fourth wave. So I do think in 2023 we need to move away from this idea that Omaha was, oh my God, it was near a disaster. It all could have gone wrong there. It had a bad start, but it was a successful landing. But again, kudos to you for mentioning the British and Canadians.
It's just past midnight on June 6, 1944, as a group of gliders descend toward the Norman countryside. Inside are paratroopers.
No. They are not paratroopers inside. They are glider-borne infantry. If I want to be really picky, you have to move those aircraft further across to the east there. They become the other side of the Orne Canal, but I understand what you're doing with the animation. That's fine there. But an airborne division, I said this with the Americans, has two types of troops within it, paratroopers and glider-borne. And the Oxenbucks light infantry, who were regular infantry converted to the glider-borne role, had not even had paratroop training. They were glider infantry. That's who was in the gliders that landed at Pegasus Bridge. They were not paratroopers. They are airborne soldiers. And it's really annoying that in 2023, with all this information out there about the Oxenbucks, a fundamentally basic mistake like that can still be being made. It's just annoying. They were airborne soldiers. They were glider-borne infantry
of the British 6th Airborne Division. They have been tasked with securing two bridges over the Caen Canal and the River Orne on the far east flank of the scheduled Allied landings in Normandy. Within 15 minutes, the assault teams managed to completely overwhelm the small German garrisons guarding the bridges and dig in as they await the arrival of the rest of the division. The bulk of the 6th Airborne was set to land just east of the River Orne, where they were to destroy 5 bridges over the River Dive and silence the Merville gun battery overlooking Sword Beach. However, in a near replay of the American drop, poor visibility and navigational errors caused the paratroopers to be scattered all across the Norman countryside. Fortunately, the area of operations lacked the thick bocage that would come to haunt the Americans, making it far easier for the paratroopers to swiftly link up in large groups. To the east, designated units set out to destroy the bridges over the Dive River, while a small group of 160 paras out of a planned 600 proceed to assault the heavily defended Merville Battery to the north.
These guys were paratroopers, yeah.
The fierceness of the following battle depletes nearly half of the assault team's strength, but by 5:30 a.m., the battery is under British control, opening the way for the invasion force anchored offshore to begin making its approach.
Slight misunderstanding implies that the invasion force off the coast are waiting for some kind of go-ahead for Merville to be knocked out before they can proceed, when in fact that was going to happen anyway. And we now know that the guns at Merville Battery weren't quite of the caliber we thought they were, and it was a little bit of a red herring despite the bravery of the guys there. But again, the amphibious elements are coming ashore regardless of what's happening here with the airborne. It's a bonus, a glorious, fantastic bonus that they've knocked out some of these positions there. But the troops are coming on Sword Beach anyway.
Stretching about 8 kilometers from the seaside town of Ouistreham to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, this beach was to be the eastern flank of operation.
It's slightly misleading because Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer is firmly on Juno Beach. The boundary between Sword and Juno is a little bit further east than this graphic is showing. Sword Beach, I would quantify, really goes as far as Lyon-sur-Mer, maybe as far as Langrune-sur-Mer. Now, we're talking about the sectors rather than the beaches, but yeah, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer which is the left flank of Juno Beach, is firmly on Juno Beach.
In Overlord. Sword's significance lay in its proximity to the city of Caen, which was a major road hub located just 12 kilometers from the beach. The British 3rd Infantry Division had been ordered to lead the assault on Sword Beach and, if possible, liberate Caen before the end of the day. Secondary objectives were awarded to the elite units of the 1st Special Service Brigade, whose men were ordered to link up with the Canadians landing on Juno Beach just off to the west, as well as relieve the embattled paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division to the southeast. Opposing the British invasion force was the German 716th Static Infantry Division. As a first line of defense, its men had littered the beach with minefields and obstacles of all kinds. Beyond that, the Brits would have to brave a series of resistance nests which stretched from the coastline all the way to Caen. The most notable amongst these were 2 formidable inland strongpoints, codenamed Morris and Hillman. These veritable fortresses were armed with heavy artillery, anti-tank weaponry, and machine gun emplacements, and were perfectly positioned to block an advance on Caen. However, the Germans' real ace in the hole came in the form of the 21st Panzer Division. Stationed near Caen, their presence in the area presented the defenders' best chance of...
Bit misleading, that graphic, because it implied 21st Panzer Division are on the beach side of Caen in real proximity to the landings. They are actually the other side. In fact, they're off where that map is there. They're between Caen and Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. But kudos to you for mentioning Hillman and Morris. And the depth of defenses on Sword Beach, because in terms of bunkers, in terms of high caliber weapons, in terms of German concrete, there are more German weapons on Sword Beach than any of the other 4 beaches.
Forcing the British troops back into the channel. As such, it was imperative for the success of the entire invasion that the 3rd Infantry Division get off the beach as quickly as possible. The citizens of Caen are still recovering from the impact of the preliminary bombardment, when the first wave of landing craft and amphibious duplex drive, or DD tanks, set off toward the shoreline. With most of the German resistance nests still intact, the vanguard of the 3rd Infantry Division face strong initial opposition. Several landing craft and vehicles are hit upon landing as the infantry struggle to reach the beach exits. In the Roger sector on the easternmost flank, French and British commandos find themselves caught in a bitter struggle around the heavily fortified casino in the town of Ouistreham. Further west, the 4th Special Service...
Just to be clear, the casino strongpoint was so named because there had been a casino there pre-war, and there's a casino there today. And in the Longest Day movie, there is a casino that they attack. The casino had long since been removed. It is a system of bunkers and trenches. So although it had the code name or the nickname of the casino strongpoint, there is no casino there. Just want to clear that up.
Brigade, tasked with linking up with the Canadians at Juno Beach, find themselves similarly pinned down by heavy enemy fire coming from the COD strongpoint in the town of Lyon-sur-Mer. Fortunately for the brigade, the belated arrival of the sluggish DD tanks and other armored vehicles quickly changes the tide of battle.
Why say they're sluggish? That's an odd comment there. DD tanks are Shermans. Shermans are one of the fastest tanks on the battlefield in World War II, so of medium size. Why say sluggish? That's an odd choice of word for the
Ford, however, is still under fire from German positions on the Perrier Ridge just south of Hermanville, as overwhelmed engineer teams frantically try to clear lanes off the increasingly congested beach. Hours pass, but luckily for the British, the expected German counterattack fails to materialize. To the south, the frustrated men of the 21st Panzer Division idle uselessly as they await explicit orders from the Führer to attack the beachhead. The Führer, however, is still soundly asleep as the bulk of the invasion force finally begins moving off the beach.
This is oversimplifying a more nuanced situation. When we talk about Hitler and the tank reserves, we're really talking about the other Panzer Corps that are not really in Normandy. That's what we're talking about. The Panzers that are near Normandy, so the 21st Panzer, 12th SS aren't far too far away. The 17th SS aren't too far away. They're not directly as simply under Hitler's command as often is said, such as this. The 21st Panzer, their own divisional commander, Feutinger, is more at fault for not moving the division than Hitler. The Hitler being asleep thing is one of those little stories about D-Day that keeps on doing the rounds, and it's way more complicated than that. The Germans have a very fractured and complicated command system, and yes, Hitler is at the top of it, but their inability to react to the invasion is way more complicated than just Hitler is asleep and no one wants to wake him up. And I understand why they put it in there, because it's a neat way of explaining it, but it's a much more complicated situation as to why the Germans don't move, or don't move till later. But that's for another day.
On the eastern flank, the men of the No. 4 Commando Unit have managed to clear out Weestrum, while just to the south, the 1st Special Service Brigade are the first to make contact with the beleaguered paratroopers at the Caen Canal and River Orne bridges.
Just to go back there slightly, they've got Bill Millin, the Piper, there at the head of the column with Lord Lovat and his commando there. Let's clear this up. They are the force everyone talks about because Lord Lovat gets there. He's the commander of the brigade, etc., etc., etc. But one of the bicycle troops and one of the other commandos had already been across the now called Pegasus Bridge before Bill Midden and Lord Lovat get there. So we want to make sure people don't go away with this thinking that the first commandos to arrive at the bridge were those with the Piper at the front. They were the second or maybe even third group of commandos to arrive, and they definitely stop and converse with Major Howard, etc., etc. But the bicycle troop of 3 Commando had already been across the bridge and were already pushing their way up to the high ground. In fact, they were already fighting at Omfreville by the time that Lord Lovat arrived.
To make contact with the beleaguered paratroopers at the Caen Canal and River Orne bridges. However, in the center, the advance off the beach is quickly reduced to a crawl at the strongpoints Morris and Hillman. The former falls after about an hour of heavy fighting, but the latter...
See, that's very misleading because Morris, the Germans had abandoned, it was Russians, we think they're Ost troops there. Morris, there was really very little of a scrap for Morris, maybe taking out some of the infantry positions in the area around him. Morris was a theoretical problem, but I don't quite know where he's got this idea with this major scrap at Morris. It's all at Hillman, and it's Hillman, not Hillman. It's named after a manufacturer of car. That's what the inland positions were named after: Daimler, Morris, Hillman. And the ones on the beach were named after fish, so cod and trout and what have you. But yeah, misleading about Morris.
Latter's defenses prove far more formidable than anticipated. Fighting at Hillman continues well into the evening, obstructing any further advances in that area. To make matters worse, at 4 o'clock, the 21st Panzer Division finally arrive on the front line to begin their counterattack. Its tanks strike right in between the British and Canadian lines, but the timely appearance of Allied armor causes heavy casualties on the charging panzers. Despite these losses, the Germans press the attack, and at 7 o'clock, some surviving elements manage to reach the coast. These depleted units, however, lack the strength to exploit their breakthrough and are subsequently ordered to withdraw.
And we should make it clear, it's not the whole division. It's elements of one regiment of the division. The rest of the division is still all off near Caen, Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. So having the entire division there moving up, although it's well done in terms of the graphics, is misleading. I mean, over to the east there, yes, the British 3rd Division, that is the entire division. They are all there, but they are not facing, as the graphic there implies, the entire 21st Panzer Division, which is a big division. Okay, it's got slightly outdated vehicles, lots of Marders, things like that, rather than updated Panzer IVs and Panthers and what have you. But it's elements of it. It's 10%, no more, of the division that actually makes its way anywhere near the beach on D-Day. So slightly misleading there.
Having braved the German counterattack, the 3rd Infantry Division attempt a final dash for Caen. Marching down the Hermanville-Caen road on foot, its men reach as far as Beeville-Beauville, a mere 7 kilometers from the Caen's city center. However, a lack of sufficient armor support and coordination with the neighboring Canadians forces the infantry to pull back as the day draws to a close. Positioned right in the middle of the Normandy invasion, the Gold Beach sector stretched from Port-en-Besson to the west.
Interesting why he goes from sword to gold. Maybe he's thinking of doing the British units first, then doing the Canadian last. But the sword and Juno story is one of two beaches side by side that work and fail, or succeed and fail based on what's happening together. I would have done it sword, Juno, and then gone to gold, but that's just maybe a personal choice. But interesting why that was done in terms of the editing and the narrative here.
To Vers-sur-Mer, some 16 kilometers to the east. High cliffs on its western end separated gold from the neighboring Americans at Omaha Beach, and forced the British to land on a flat stretch of ground between La Hamelle and La Rivière. The experienced British 50th Infantry Division had been entrusted to link up with both the American and Canadian beachheads, sever the road and railway to Caen, and capture the city of Bayeux, some 13 kilometers inland.
Bayeux.
Opposing the 50th Division would be elements of both the German 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions, including a mobile response unit in the form of Kampfgruppe Meyer. 11 resistance nests, as well as 2 partially completed coastal gun batteries, augmented the defense further, though few were made out of the near.
And I would have mentioned the horseshoe shape of inland artillery and other German positions that were around. There's kind of the Movan Ridge, which isn't on the map there, there's this kind of high ground that goes in like a horseshoe, like a U shape as we look at that map there. And I would have mentioned the second line of German defenses around there if it were me, because that's where a lot of the fighting occurred in the gold sector later on. We did a show on our channel about that with Peter Caddick Adams, about the Devons and others pushing towards Herod's Well position, which on that map there is kind of in the lower middle.
Indestructible concrete that characterized the Omaha sector. At 5:30 a.m., the head-pounding roar from Bombarding Force K signals the start of the preliminary naval bombardment.
I love the fact the Navy
Crucially, 3 of the 4 guns of the Longue-sur-Mer coastal gun battery are knocked out by direct hits. The first wave, following in the bombardment's wake, however, quickly finds out that the powerful strongpoints at La Hamelle and La Rivière are still very much intact. Within short succession, several tanks and other vehicles are knocked out as the infantry scurry behind the seawall. Fortunately, a specialized flail tank is quick to react and manages to silence the deadly 88mm gun at La Rivière before it has a chance to do more damage. Further to the west, in the Jig sector, elements of the 1st Hampshires managed to neutralize the more weakly defended position at the village of Anel before circling inland to attack the strongpoints at La Hamelle from the rear. Meanwhile, in the King sector, infantry of the 5th East Yorkshires begin to systematically clear out the fortified houses at La Rivière along the shore, while flail tanks try to clear out lanes for the invasion force to move inland. With the immediate landing zone coming under Allied control, men of the 1st Battalion Hampshire Regiment managed to seize Armagnac, while the 47th Royal Marine Commando march on Port-en-Besson to link up with the neighboring Americans. Back at King, the 6th Green Howards, with armor from the Dragoon Guards, clear a lane of the beach and move to assault the batteries at Montfleury and Vers-sur-Mer. Joined by the 5th East Yorkshire, they continue to advance down the road before clashing with Kampfgruppe Meyer near the town of Brazenville. Luckily for the British, the battle group was caught by surprise and virtually annihilated during the following engagement. With most of the immediate German resistance neutralized or subdued, the British vanguard managed to link up with the Canadians, but lacked the strength to make the final push to Bayeux before nightfall. By midnight on June 6th, the British invasion force had succeeded in achieving about half of its objectives. At Sword, close to 29,000 men had come ashore at the cost of around 1,000 casualties.
Bit higher than
the 6th Airborne, on its part, had secured a beachhead on the eastern bank of the Orne, while blocking the way for the Germans to reinforce the defense of the beach. Crucially, though, the British had not been able to capture Caen on the first day. A failure that would prove extremely costly for the Allies, as it allowed the Germans time to reinforce their line with several elite panzer divisions. The Norman city would not finally be liberated until July 19th.
I feel that failure is a harsh word there. Caen was always an ambitious and unlikely to be achieved mission for the 3rd Division on D-Day. It comes about partly because of Dempsey commanding 2nd Army, who, when he commanded a corps in Operation Husky in Sicily, his corps had got in 12, 13 miles in of D-Day in Sicily. So he felt it was appropriate, and Montgomery endorsed this to set the same kind of standard of 12, 13 miles inland on the first day in Normandy. But realistically, to actually get and seize Caen D-Day, and what do you mean by that? Does it mean getting your boots into the outskirts of town? Does it mean getting into the city centre, which doesn't help you at all? Does it mean, which is what it really does mean, getting to the high ground south of Caen so you can start establishing airfields? To me, as a Brit, the stick with which historians have beaten Montgomery and the British for years is the failure to get to Caen on D-Day. It was a huge task to have considered the possibility of getting a division inland and seizing a town 12 miles inland from an invasion beach. And yes, it took a month to take it. And yes, there was lots of fighting, and Operation Charmwood and Operations Windsor, etc., and Goodwood to the east were very important. And it did allow Germans time to bring up their armored divisions. But I think calling it a failure is not referencing the fact that the Sword Beach landing was a successful landing. They eliminated the coastal defenses. They eliminated the threat of a minor, albeit minor, 21st Panzer counterattack. They linked up with the British Airborne. They linked up with Juno Beach. That is a successful landing. Yes, there's no cherry on the top of getting Caen, but to me, using the word failure is very harsh there.
At Gold Beach, around 24,500 men occupied the largest Allied beachhead of the entire invasion. At the relatively merciful cost of 400 casualties, the 50th Infantry Division had shattered the German defensive positions opposing them, and connected its front with the Canadians at Juno Beach. Although the Brits had failed to contact the Americans and capture Bayeux, they stood poised to liberate the weakly defended city on the following day. If British casualties on D-Day were less grievous than Allied planners had anticipated, their Canadian comrades were to be less fortunate. We'll take a closer look at the landings on Juno Beach, also known as the Canadian Omaha.
I've never heard it called the Canadian Omaha, and I've read a lot of books about Normandy and D-Day.
Stretching around 8 kilometers from Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer in the east to Courseulles-sur-Mer in the west, Juno Beach was situated in between the British sectors of Gold and Sword. Its most significant landmark was the Compiquet airfield, located some 17 kilometers inland just to the west of the city of Caen. Allied planners had made it a priority to expand Allied air superiority as soon as possible, and the capture of Compiquet was deemed an important first step to achieve this goal. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had been assigned to assault up the beach, seize the airfield, and sever the Paris-Cherbourg railway line. If possible, the 3rd Infantry Division would also support a potential assault on Caen, with British forces advancing from Sword Beach. Like their British comrades in arms, the Canadian invasion force would face units of the German 716th Static Infantry Division, which had positioned themselves in pillboxes and fortified houses in various fishing villages along the coast. The most formidable of these resistance nests were located in Bernières-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, whose large vacation homes provided the defenders with excellent vantage points over the beach, while skillfully positioned gun emplacements could pick off approaching armor at range. Elsewhere, on-rails machine gun teams had the ability to rapidly reposition their heavy equipment to suppress large sections of the beach. At dawn, the Allied Armada offshore opens fire on the German batteries and strongpoints in the Juno Beach sector, as the men of the Canadian 7th and 8th Brigades ready themselves to open the assault on the beach. At 7:30, the first landing craft set off from their assembly points, but the rough waters of the channel quickly slow the advance to the beach. The Germans, in the meantime, have suffered only minor damage from the opening bombardment as they prepare themselves to meet the first wave with withering fire. At around 7:50, landing craft carrying engineer elements of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles are the first to lower their ramps in the Mike sector near Courseulles-sur-Mer, while delayed elements of the Queen's Own and Royal Regina Rifles are closing in further to the east in the Nan sector. Many of the amphibious duplex drive tanks of the 1st Hussars that were supposed to come ashore alongside the infantry faltered in the Channel waters, with only 14 arriving on the beach intact. Lacking adequate armor support, the Winnipeg's men are mercilessly cut down by intense German fire. Further to the west, other elements find the German strongpoints opposing them greatly weakened or already destroyed by the preliminary bombardment. After a brief firefight, the few remaining positions are neutralized as the Canadians begin to advance inland. Further to the east, in the Nan sector, the Regina Rifles similarly managed to silence most of the initial German defenses in front of the Courcelles-sur-Mer in rapid succession, and by 8 o'clock, its men are already advancing into the town itself. Its abandoned vacation homes, however, provide ample opportunity for the Germans to transform its quaint streets into a veritable killing zone, forcing the Reginas to begin the time-consuming task of clearing out enemy snipers and makeshift strongpoints. Just a few kilometers to the east, the Queen's Own Rifles are facing another type of nightmare in front of Bernières-sur-Mer. Sandbars and other obstacles obstruct the way to the beach, forcing the Queen's Own to wade through deep water before making a near-suicidal dash across 183 meters of beach without armored support. Crossfire from several hidden German emplacements, including an 88mm gun, devastates the struggling infantry, and within a matter of minutes, 65 Canadian soldiers lay dead or wounded on the beach. On the far eastern end of Juno, elements of the North Shore Regiment, landing in front of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, are faced with a similar predicament as ferocious fire.
Well, they didn't land directly in front at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. That's one of the parts of that story there, is that it was too fortified on the beach directly in front of the town there. They kind of came in from behind and used the tank destroyers and stuff to attack the positions there. So that's that. It's been really good, this, but a Canadian historian would say it's a little bit simplified. But hey, fantastic. They're giving the Canadians their credit here. They've always
coming from undamaged German positions atop the town's high seawall, annihilate the regiment's supporting tanks within a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, the arrival of reinforcements changes the tide of battle at Bernières-sur-Mer as the decimated men of the Queen's Own manage to overcome the Germans and move into the town. While the infantry are finding ways to move inland, increasingly agitated tank crews are finding it impossible to traverse the high-curved seawall. As engineers race against time to create makeshift ramps and open other exits off the landing zone, the beach is quickly becoming congested with the incoming tide. In the meantime, advancing Canadian infantry are moving to outflank the last pockets of German resistance. Courcelles, Bernières, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer all fall under Canadian control. By 10 o'clock, the advance southward is ready to begin in earnest. Within an hour, the Québécois regiment stands outside the outskirts of Benny-sur-Mer, while follow-up waves equip.
They are the Regiment de Chaudière, who happen to be from Quebec. They're French Canadians, but the regimental title is the Regiment de la Chaudière.
Equipped with bicycles, rush down to catch up with the vanguard. On the western flank, the Canadian, Scottish, and Winnipeg Rifles link up in the marshes around Sainte-Croix-sur-Mer, while the Regina Rifles and 1st Hussars advance towards the Rivière. With their line broken, the defenders of the 716th Infantry Division are powerless to withstand the weight of the Canadian advance. With the fall of Benny-sur-Mer, the road to Capiquet Airfield and the Paris-Cherbourg railway line now lay wide open. However, just as follow-up units continue to advance southward, the eastern flank is attacked by elements of the 21st Panzer Division. Attempting to push the Allies back into the channel, the 21st's Panzers drive in between the Canadian and British lines toward the sea. The attack, however, fails to dislodge the Allies, and the 3rd Infantry Division recontinue the advance in hopes of reaching their primary objectives before nightfall. Dashing ahead, elements of the 1st Hussars manage to sever the Conn Bayou Highway, while the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers fight their way into the towns of Villon, Buisson, and Anisy. With the Canadians now a mere 5 kilometers away from the Capiquet airfield, its garrison panics and initiates a haphazard evacuation. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the 3rd Infantry Division receive orders to halt the advance and dig in for the night and prepare for another expected German counterattack. By the end of D-Day, the men of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had established a beachhead that stretched around 16 kilometers inland, which was further than any of the other beaches on the first day of the invasion. In return for this remarkable feat, its men had suffered serious losses during their initial landings on the beach, which were dwarfed only by the casualties the Americans sustained on Omaha. However, the Canadians had fallen short of their primary objectives. Their failure to capture the Kapike airfield in particular would soon prove to have been a costly mistake. By the end of the next day,
That's harsh again. It's not a mistake. They were beaten back by strong German resistance. A mistake is someone fucking up. It's someone doing something wrong. Sure, every now and then you can see little bits of indecision amongst the British and Canadian commanders, but this is really harsh. A mistake. It's not a mistake to not reach your ultimate objectives. Attacking is hard. Amphibious landings are hard. They usually work okay, but you have a set of goals. And the first goal of Operation Overlord is don't die. Get there and make sure it doesn't fail. That's the first thing. It didn't fail. The beachhead is head. You said it yourself there. They've got that beachhead. The second thing is try and link the beachheads together, which they've nearly achieved. And the third thing is you have these ambitious, often ambitious inland objectives, most of which were not actually reached by the Allies on D-Day, but they're there. The outcome is only going to go one way. Absolutely. It took longer to get Caen than perhaps we'd thought. Okay, it took longer to get to Cherbourg, longer to get to Saint-Lô. But when you skip ahead to the end of the Normandy campaign, 76 days, it comes in under what had been predicted by the Allied planners. Okay, there's a lot of kind of guesswork involved when Montgomery is outlining his hopes for 21st Army Group back in the spring of 44, and he's setting these phase lines. You know, you can't possibly predict what the Germans are going to do to try and stop the invasion, but we need to move away from this idea that Normandy was slow and ponderous and everything took too much time. The D-Day worked really well, just didn't achieve its absolute ultimate ambitious goals, but the Battle of Normandy came out under schedule with less people being killed than had been predicted, and I don't like this idea of words being like failure and mistake with regards to the progression of Allied troops on D-Day.
Powerful German reinforcements in the form of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, moved into the area, marking the start of a month-long bitter struggle which would not end until Kapike was finally captured on July 9th.
So there we are. On the whole, I really like that. There are a few ways you could use 35 minutes more effectively to understand how Operation Overlord panned out than watching that video there. So top marks overall for how the Armchair Historian has taken a complicated battle like Operation Overlord and condensed it to an understandable, graphically interesting story to convey that story. However, as you've heard me say, there are these annoying little mistakes. The pronunciations are a bit iffy. This suggestion that the guys at Pegasus Bridge were paratroopers when they in fact were glide infantry, the not acknowledging that there are 2 battalions of tanks in Omaha Beach. These are fundamental mistakes about D-Day that keep getting repeated. If you follow my channel a lot, you'll realize I'm trying to address these narratives that won't go away. We're stuck with the idea that Napoleon was short, for example, when he wasn't. We're stuck with these things. It takes people like myself and lots of other fantastic historians. I want to mention Brad on this day, Canadian Military History, who's doing fantastic work to get the Canadian story across, JD at History Underground, Chris at Vlogging Through History, many other channels out there, History Explorer, Rob, are doing fantastic work there, but sometimes a little bit more preparation, a little bit more checking of the script, and maybe I'm going to call you out, Armchair Historian. Send your video to someone like me. Send it to Peter Caddick Adams. Let them have a look at it before you go online. Let us point out a couple of things and say, it might be better if you did this and did this. But yeah, okay, I'm a small fish. You're huge. But overall, fantastic effort. But there are these niggling things. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please check out our other content. Normally what I do is I have a historian on. We come on and we talk about a subject for an hour or so, and we do the Pacific Theater, the Eastern Front, we do the ETO, we look at technology, we look at figures, we look at leadership, we look at particular regiments. So check us out and use our playlists to find out the content that you're interested in. Also, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to consider becoming a patron or a channel member. And again, if you want to check out the links, they're all in the description below. So thanks everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.